Akash, my man. How you doing? Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
What's happening? What are you up to? You know what's funny is like I feel like I know you. I don't know you though. You've been like recently one of my favorite follows the past like 6 months to a year. Um, but yeah, just feel like I feel like I know you, but I don't. And so we were about to like do a little of this off air, but I was like, I just talk to me, tell me about yourself when we start recording, because I think if you are a listener of the podcast, like you are absolutely somebody that I highly recommend people follow, even if you're not highly in the social media game and so far as you're like posting every day. But I think whenever you do put something out, whether it's on stories, mostly when you're reposting my stuff, or if you're putting out some sort of feed content, like you do an amazing job. So tell us about yourself.
I appreciate it. Social media is funny like that. I feel like there's people I talk to more often than the people that I've met in person and know in my life, like family and friends. And I end up talking to them on social media every single day. But a little bit about me. I'm from Long Island, New York. Went to GW, George Washington University for undergrad. I was pre-med there and a business major, and then had bio and chem minors as well. And then now I made my way down a little bit further south. I'm in Miami for med school, doing an MD MBA dual degree program, and I'm graduating in May, which is nuts. So I'll be a doctor in May, and then I start the next stage of my training, which is residency. So that's after med school, you start specializing. I applied internal medicine residency, so in the next few weeks, I'll actually be finding out where I'll end up for residency in the country. So that's exciting. And then my end goal is to pursue a fellowship in oncology. That's always kind of been the specialty that I've been drawn to for a whole bunch of reasons. Want to be an oncologist, but as you know, I'm also really passionate about nutrition, lifestyle medicine. I got the MBA kind of thinking more about how our healthcare system works and how we can improve certain aspects of our healthcare system, as well as tying in my interest in lifestyle medicine into cancer care. So those are kind of a little bit all over the place, but the things that keep me going.
Dude, yeah. Like that's awesome. That's awesome. That is incredible, man. I'm pumped. I mean, you're a good dude, very smart dude. I mean, you're gonna do some real good for the people that come across your path in the future.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that.
Tell me a bit about. We were talking a bit about what we want to talk about today, and we're going to talk about some of the dietary guideline stuff. And you had mentioned, hey, I'm kind of working with HHS in some stuff here. Give me a little feel of what you're doing right now.
Yeah, so one thing that I've always been passionate about coming into med school was improving nutrition training for doctors and getting some sort of foundational level because it's such an integral part of patient health, but not really a huge part of medical curricula. There's no standards. So that's something I was passionate about coming into medical school, started working on it at my own school. Big emphasis has really been working with registered dietitians because we already have specialists that this is what they do. They're trained in this. So I think giving physicians some foundational knowledge is really valuable, but also teaching them how to work with dietitians and also at the systemic level, improving some of the barriers, like making it easier to get coverage for medical nutrition therapy in the preventative setting and things like that. Um, so that's some of the work that I've been doing. And then from a federal level, the administration also shares this common goal. So one of the big pushes of RFKs and HHS is to improve nutrition training for doctors. And so RFK kind of put out a feeler almost with medical schools to see who's interested in collaborating on this shared goal that we have. And that really should be an apolitical issue, keeping things evidence-based. And so that's kind of the capacity we've been working in right now. We already had this nutrition curriculum going, but now there's also federal support as well. So working on the contents of the nutrition curricula as well as expansion and how we can think about these ideas and integrate nutrition into medical training without overloading students and while doing an effective way to actually make them competent, not just check off a box and say, yeah, they were exposed to one nutrition course. And so that's really what we're working on and see if we can create a standard for that.
I said that we wouldn't get lost on this because we could do a whole topic on it, a whole podcast on it. But I'm gonna have to follow up, and that is, if you think of the end goal, right? The end goal is helping patients, and having doctors have a greater understanding of nutrition and lifestyle is makes sense, but also just improving their ability to collaborate with dietitians also makes sense. Like we already have people who do that, right? It's how much if remembering the goal is helping patients, how much or which how would you what feels more like a more fruitful thing to do? Teach doctors more about nutrition, or somehow improve the system by which they collaborate with dietitians?
I think they're not mutually exclusive. I think we can make progress in both fronts. It's hard to quantify like what would be the most valuable route to go down and yield some sort of return. I think these kind of work synergistically. Like if we can get doctors to see the importance of lifestyle in patient care, it's not just about them doing like some basic dietary counseling. Yes, I've seen a lot of doctors give terrible dietary advice, and if they were trained even to a foundational level, they could have given in those quick moments with the patient some better advice. But it also will get them to ultimately refer to dietitians more because now they see the importance of lifestyle, specifically nutrition, in their patient care. So I still think that training doctors will ultimately facilitate the increased referral. And that's just a theory, not anything we've studied, that if we train them more, they'll refer to more to dietitians. But I do think there's a lot of systemic barriers too, right? Like there's not enough dietitians to work with everyone preventatively. The way that physicians and healthcare professionals in general are reimbursed, it's not based off of quality of care in this country. It's largely based off of quantity of care and the amount of things that you provide. And so then you kind of fall into all these different, and I'm sure there's a whole different route we can go down there in terms of physician reimbursement and our payer systems and all that stuff. But I think, not exactly a clear answer to your question, but I think there's value in both. I think there's value in seeing how we can improve interprofessional collaboration, but also improving nutrition training for physicians.
Yeah, I don't think that was ever going to be an easy question to answer. You even answered part of what makes that challenging from a lack of dietitian and how doctors are being reimbursed. And so those were two good answers. We're going to park that for now, but I am fascinated with that. I think that that's a super important thing. And I even find that interesting where, again, that might just be a hypothesis on your end of like, hey, if we even just education to the level of an understanding of how powerful lifestyle can improve or increase, referring to dietitians and like spotting moments where the dietitian would be the better person to help, makes a lot of sense to me, rather than making a doctor into a dietitian and trying to have all that counseling in the moment. It's like, can we get you educated enough to understand what's possible so that you can identify when it would be appropriate to refer out?
Yeah, and I think a great analogy that someone brought up to me once, and I can't give the person credit because it was a random commenter on one of my posts, but it was that, we're not, for example, replacing pharmacists when we learn pharmacology, but we still get a foundational understanding of how, different drugs work in the body, the mechanisms, as well as of just about these drugs generally. So we get a foundational understanding of pharmacology. It doesn't mean that we're replacing pharmacists, but now we can work better with pharmacists and we can know when to defer to those experts. So I really like that analogy, and I wish I could credit this person beyond random commenter on my Instagram post, but that's it.
Yeah, whoever he or she is out there, I'm sure, of course, they're listening to this podcast right now, feeling really, really, really good about themselves. Good,
Yeah,
good.
shout out random commenter.
Yeah, yeah. Let's do a soft pivot here. We're going to talk about the dietary guidelines. I think we're what are we, a couple months out from the release of the guidelines, and people have heard left, right, up, and down everything about the guidelines, every critique, and I don't want to do a forensic look through every single line of the guidelines, but I do want this to be a bit of a resource for, let's say somebody messages me like, hey, you have a podcast on the guidelines? Like, I'd like this to be something I could send to them, even if it is admittedly not you and I pulled up the guidelines and sat through every single line. We've both read the guidelines, but this won't be a look through every single line and every single semantics of word choices, although I'd like to talk about some of that. So just to set the scene, I think one of the things that I've learned a lot more about and find fascinating is how the dietary guidelines are created. So can you talk to me about that and which parts of that you think are important to touch on?
Yeah, so I think historical context helps a little bit. So the first report that was treated as like the real dietary guidelines that was created jointly by HHS and the USDA was in 1980. And then there were some questions raised about if there was enough scientific evidence to support these dietary guidelines. So a few years later in 1983, it was Congress that decided that there should be an external body, an advisory committee of selected scientists who their role is to review that 1980 report and see what could be updated. And so then they came out with the 1985 report. And so since then, there's been this precedent of every 5 years, we're going to release the dietary guidelines. And 2 years before the release, we're going to select what's known as the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. And so this is, like I said, a selection of scientists and experts within the field, have at least 10 years of experience. And in the last Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, or DGAC for short, I think would be easier to refer to them going forward, was about 20 members, if I remember correctly. And so these are classified as like special government employees, but they're actually not paid. So this is volunteer work. There's reimbursements for travel and things like that. But something that I was surprised about was how rigid of a process this is. I think a lot of times there's a lot of misunderstanding about how the dietary guidelines uh, are created, and it's a little bit of a black box for people if they're not aware of the process. So it feels like every 5 years the government's just saying, "Here's how you should eat," but you're questioning, are there conflicts of interest? Can I trust this? Does this actually support what the or reflect what the science supports? And so I think something that was really interesting, I spoke with Dr. Christopher Gardner, who was one of the members of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. He also did a podcast with Danny on Sigma Nutrition, where he kind of spoke about this process at depth. And I've spoken to Dr. Gardner separately as well. And it is a really like rigid and thorough process, and also transparent in the sense like everybody has to report potential conflicts of interest. Even the selection process starts out with nomination. So you have to be nominated, you have to have a certain number of years of experience, and then they whittle it down to 20 members. There's also a paper that I can share with you if you want to put it in the show notes, that was titled, it was in 2024 that I came across, addressing misinformation about the dietary guidelines for Americans. And I think that that really sums up really well some of the common misconceptions, and kind of just going into like where that distrust comes from. And that's something that I was guilty of too before I understood what the process was. I was like, can we really trust this? Or what's happening behind this curtain that we don't really know about? But I think it stems from the fact that if we just zoom out at a very broad level, our chronic disease burden is tremendous. And we've had dietary guidelines since 1980. And so people, and logically, it makes sense to fault the guidelines and say, well, a lot of our cardiometabolic diseases are largely diet related. We have these dietary guidelines, but for some reason, people just keep getting sicker and sicker. And it makes sense, but that kind of falls apart quickly when you actually realize that most of the US population doesn't follow the dietary guidelines. So it's less of a problem of the guidelines themselves, but the adherence to them. And we actually have data showing that when people adhere more closely to the dietary guidelines, they have better health outcomes. And so there's a few studies on this, like it's called the Healthy Eating Index, where they look at a prospective cohort and they assign, based on people's diets, a score. And that score is based on how closely it aligns with the dietary guidelines. And what we consistently see is that people that adhere more closely to the dietary guidelines have like lower risk of chronic diseases and all-cause mortality. So the most recent data that I've seen was based on the 2015 to 2020 dietary guidelines, and they used the healthy eating index, and they found that the difference between the highest quintile and the lowest quintile, this was 12,000 people they were looking at, it was a 16% lower risk of cardiovascular disease incidence, 32% lower risk of cardiovascular disease mortality, and 18% lower risk of all-cause mortality. And so this kind of shows that it's, again, not the fault of the guidelines, but adherence. And that doesn't automatically mean that it's the fault of the individual either. I think we're in a food system that, our food supply is inconsistent with recommendations. Our food system makes it really difficult and oftentimes inaccessible for the average person to make those healthy choices. So I know that's a lot of information, but that's a little bit of the history of the dietary guidelines, how the process works, and where we're at in terms of trying to actually get people to make the changes that align with the guidelines.
Yeah, I think it's an important point to overlay, which is that we can talk about the dietary guidelines all we want, but what we're really after is improving, chronic disease rates in this country, and hopefully through the dietary guidelines, helping people figure out what to eat. But it is, as of right now, a fact that, the guide. It's funny. One of the points I asked you to come up with 3 to 5 points that you feel strongly about with the dietary guidelines, and one of mine would have been, it's a cap to how excited I'll get about this topic, because I just know that the implementation of this stuff and getting people to follow the guidelines to actually make changes is not hinging on what these guidelines are. And that doesn't mean we don't talk about it, doesn't mean it's not relevant. It's super relevant, and it's going to be relevant for some certain things we're going to talk about in a bit. But that is a point that it was important for us to say now, which is like, yeah, people don't really follow the guidelines for the most part. And that doesn't make them useless, but it does mean it is a very important piece of context. When we're trying to decide how important this is, we can say, hey, it's important, for certain things we'll talk about in a bit, maybe quite a bit, and then on a very individual level, maybe a little bit less so. But we still make them. They still go out there, and that means we should do as good of a job with them as possible. I want to circle back to the makeup of the advisory committee.
Mm-hmm.
You talked a little bit about how you can be nominated, and does it at least this time around? Is there an attempt to have maybe a good mix of representation from industry? Like, is there going to be a circumstance where people are like, wow, the whole committee everyone's got a plant-based conflict of interest, or they all worked for seed oil companies, or do we have is there a pursuit of a mix of representation? Is that something that's taken into account?
Yeah, so there's transparency in terms of what the affiliations are. So you can see, and I don't have them all memorized off the top of my head, but you can see what the affiliations of each member is. And it's really based off of expertise as opposed to their affiliation. So it's not like, oh,
Sure,
we're going to get
sure.
one representative from
No,
the
of
meat
course, of
lobby.
course. But is that a
It's based.
critique that has been levied ever of like, oh, this, because we will talk a bit about dietary guidelines and where some of the references were, and
Mhm.
in industry effect there. But I could see that being something that was taken into account, because you're right, very transparent. And if we look at the conflict, is it such that it's weighted very heavily in a direction that could ultimately, be under fire as like, well, actually, they said this because look at all these conflicts of interest? Or has that been
Yeah.
something that like we generally end up having enough of a level of transparency and a good mix of representation that hasn't been an issue?
Yeah, I mean, based on my opinion of that advisory committee, I don't think it was like heavily skewed in any way. Uh, if you actually compare it to the people who put together the final dietary guidelines, I would say that was far more skewed in terms of industry influence. And I think there's a separate conversation to be had there in terms of should the USDA play a role in the dietary guidelines. And just to close the loop on kind of the process, I didn't finish what happens, but after the advisory committee meets like several hours per week over the course of 2 years, volunteering their time, they submit a report to the USDA and HHS, and then they ultimately decide what they want it to look like, so they can take into consideration the advisory committee or not. But again, ultimately, this is coming down to expertise, and I think there's also we could go down a lot of different side quests here to talk about, but I think conflict of interest is tricky when you look at industry funding and industry ties. It is really expensive to do research. And so I'm not someone who automatically discredits research based on industry funding or ties. I think you have to ultimately look at the actual data itself. And if there's consistency there, I'm not going to write off an entire study or report or whatever it is simply based off of the conflicts of interest, but rather the methodology. And do I feel like this was sound research? And I think another indicator of that, and something we'll probably go into a little bit later, is even if you were like a full-blown conspiracist that big pharma is running the show on our dietary guidelines or the meat lobby or whoever it is, you can look across the globe, right? Like there's relatively consistent consensus on what comprises a healthy dietary pattern overall across different countries' dietary guidelines, as well as different organizations. So the American Heart Association, the European Atherosclerotic Society, all these different groups, there's pretty much consistence in the patterns that are seen. So even if you thought Big Pharma was running the show in the US, is it feasible, like rationally speaking, that every scientist and nutrition expert in the world is in on some conspiracy for the last few decades? I think that's a question that I pose to people who are quick to write off any sort of institutional guidance.
So we have 20 nationally recognized scientists who are incredibly transparent about their conflict of interest, who work for free for 2 years to I work for free, right? But there's no compensation. It's not necessarily a paid job here. Who work for 2 years rigorously to scour the best and most recent data, to aggregate all of it, and come up with recommendations that they then bring to USDA and HHS.
Yep.
And the question that must be asked is, why isn't that just the guidelines then?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I ultimately think that it should be, because you're ultimately calling upon these people who are the experts and are the ones reviewing the science, are most familiar with that process of critical appraisal of research, but not just the critical appraisal skills, but also the content familiarity. Like, this is the field that they work in. So I think that really ultimately should be what we go based off of. And I think there is a little bit of a conflict of interest, or maybe more than a little bit, when you hand it over to the USDA in particular to decide what they want to take and what they don't.
Is this something people talk about? I mean, this is something like it seems like a no-brainer. Hey, let's outsource this to professionals, and I just don't hear enough people clamoring for like, hey, it's this simple. Like, we fix the guidelines by just taking it out of making it an apolitical thing here.
Yeah, and I think that's the issue, right? Like, politics largely can influence what ends up in the guidelines, and ultimately our goal should be objective. It should be population health and public health. So, and I think it also contradicts the whole reason why the advisory committee was made. Going back to that 1980 report, the first one, that was done by scientists within HHS and the USDA. So they intentionally outsourced it to the advisory committee so that you made sure that there was a much higher standard that you were being held to in the quality of information that you were giving out in this report.
Have you read the I wouldn't know exactly it what they are, the report that the committee is making and then handing over? That's public. You can view that. You can read that. Have you read
Yep.
it?
I have. It's about 420
It's
pages.
crazy long. I was like,
A
I'll
really
browse it before me and Akash get on.
um, I can't say I thoroughly read line for line. I've
Sure.
skimmed it, focused on certain sections, but I think that's something else. Like, people are quick to just criticize and write off like, oh, this is all conflict of interest or this is a conspiracy. But I think if you sit down and actually go through the report, you see how much time and consideration goes into the recommendations. And there's so many factors in which we can go into that are not necessarily apparent when you're thinking, oh, they're just telling us to eat more fruits and veggies. Like, there's so much to unpack behind that as well.
Would you mind terribly if I read a couple of quotes from the executive summary from the committee's report?
Yeah.
Because I
This
think
is, so just to clarify, this is from the advisory committee, not the published report
correct,
for guidelines. Okay.
correct. This is from the executive summary of the committee's report. And I think I'll read them now because they won't mean anything until we talk about the guidelines. And my point being just that they sound different. And I think that there's just something to be, again, I don't want this, not a big conspiracy. I don't want this to get some angry bashing of this administration. I don't want to do that. But I think it's important to know, hey, what was handed over to RFK, let's just use him as a figurehead for all of this, was different. And that is something you should know. So I'll read a couple of them. Just let me do it. I know it'll be long
Yeah.
here.
It'd be funny if we pulled the same quotes, because I pulled a few in preparation for this.
Great. As the committee considered the evidence, which encompassed multiple life stages, a dietary pattern emerged that was consistently related to beneficial health. This healthy dietary pattern for individuals ages 2 and older is higher in vegetables, fruits, legumes, beans, peas, and lentils, nuts, whole grains, fish, and vegetable oils, higher in unsaturated fat, and lower in red and processed meats, sugar-sweetened foods, beverages, refined grains, and saturated fat. And I just another one is social determinants of health, which include economic, environmental, social, educational, and structural factors, play a role in dietary intakes throughout the lifespan because they impact the ability of individuals and population groups to access healthy foods and achieve nutrition recommendations. So to me, that one stuck out as just an acknowledgement of the social determinants of health, which I just think is a glaring omission among a couple other things. The first quote was just, hey, the first 3 things that are listed are fruits, vegetables, and legumes, nuts, whole grains, fish, higher in vegetable oils, lower in saturated fat, higher in unsaturated fat, lower in red meat. And you will see a distinct difference between that language and what comes up in the dietary guidelines. Evidence indicates that when reducing butter, processed and unprocessed red meat, and dairy, substitution or replacement with a wide range of plant-based food sources, including plant-based protein foods, beans, peas, and lentils, whole grains, vegetables, unsaturated fats, mono and polyunsaturated rich vegetable oils, and spreads, is associated with cardiovascular disease risk reduction. So again, a just not so subtle reminder of slightly less red meat, more plant foods, more legumes, lower in saturated fat for improved heart health outcomes. Did you have one? Did you bring one as well? I feel like
Yeah, I think when we go into like where the committee's report has discordance with the actual report, I can go into some of the quotes I pulled. But
great.
I think what's interesting is like the first thing you said about a healthy dietary pattern that you described, it's not sexy. I think that's a big part of the problem is like that largely has not changed over the last few decades. More or less, that's what's been recommended by a variety of different bodies over several decades, maybe with a few tweaks. And I think specifically with respect to plant proteins, which we can get into. But overall, that doesn't sound sexy. So I think it opens up this opportunity for a lot of the people on social media to come in and be like, hey, everything you've been told is a lie. We're sick because they've been recommending this. And here's actually what you should be doing.
And for the listener, we're going to talk about the guidelines in a second, and then we're going to take a look at some guidelines of other countries around the world that have updated their guidelines fairly recently. And you might hear a bit more of a similar thread of plant-based protein sources, a reduction in saturated fat intake, etc. And I don't want this to be like some bashing, but I think these are, when I read through this executive summary, it reads completely differently in my mind. It reads clearly as if someone else wrote it with different points of view. It's also written, like you said, it's so not sexy. It's actually insanely not sexy. It's written by someone who's terrible at marketing, who's a terrible writer if your goal is to be compelling. It's not compelling at all. The language is balanced. It's literally, I was chuckling reading it. I was like, this is written by people who really do science, who use way too many like might be and could be and a bit of this and balance and this, and you're so right to say that it's not sexy, because reading through it I was like, man, they need like someone's PR to come in here. And of course that's not the point. They know that this is being handed to someone else to kind of take it home, so to speak, who will have more of a motivation to add that sort of language in there. But it is so not a sexy read.
Yeah, and even in that process that the advisory committee goes through, there's an evaluation of the strength of the research supporting certain claims, and that actually dictates the language so specifically of like when you say could be, might be, or likely produces benefit with this substitution, whatever it may be. That's very carefully thought out based on how much evidence there is to support that claim. And I think that's something that scientists do because science is measured and nuanced. And so you definitely see that discrepancy between that report and then what's ultimately published.
Yeah. There was another part about the committee recommends moving beans, peas, and lentils as a subgroup of the vegetables food into a subgroup of the protein foods to align with evidence to encourage plant sources of protein foods, basically to like put beans, peas, and lentils on par with like other what we would consider top tier proteins. And I just feel like they were made into a bit of an afterthought. But before we get to our current guidelines, the thing that we led with this bit of a discussion of like, hey, people don't follow the guidelines, and it's not that simple, but okay, whatever. People don't follow the guidelines, but they do influence food programs within our country. Could you talk a little bit about, because I think that's where it's not a matter of people choosing to follow the guidelines. It's going to affect these things where, certain circumstances like school lunches or SNAP or WIC or et cetera, will get influenced whether, you choose to have that happen or not.
Yeah. And so I think that's a common misconception, definitely one that I held for a while, was that the guidelines are intended for direct use by the public. And it's really not. It's meant for guiding clinicians and, more importantly, institutional meals. So like you mentioned, school meals, the military's meals, and importantly, food assistance programs like SNAP and WIC that you mentioned. And so that's ultimately what's dictating. And what's funny is I actually called up a friend who works at a school and works with their nutrition and the school meals and all that stuff, and kind of wanted to gauge how much this new dietary guidelines would affect them. And something that she said was ultimately they go based off of, and we'll get into this when we get into the guidelines, but they go off of like the quantitative limits. So like the 10% limit on saturated fat hasn't changed. So even though there's all this messaging and communication around we need to stop villainizing saturated fats and saturated fats are heart healthy fats and they're flipping that narrative, ultimately that 10% limit is what's guiding their selection. So again, like how much damage will actually occur, it's limited in that sense. Obviously, there's a lot of confusion in terms of interpretation of the visual and all that stuff that we'll go into. But I think that that was an interesting point. And that's off of one conversation. So I don't know if that's 100% true in terms of all of the programs.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense because those are more explicit than like, here's our infographic and then, make your meals off of this infographic. They kind of, if it's trying to be more streamlined and consistent across the country, they're going to go off of more of those explicit, this much protein or this much saturated fat, etc.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about the guidelines. Again, not a forensic look through every line of the guideline, but I'd love to hear, let's say, your top 3 points. And they can be specific. They can be vibes that you get. They can be whatever you felt when you read through them and, in the last couple of months, as you've, I'm sure, had plenty of discussions about them. What do you feel are the 3 most powerful points that you feel?
I think that one is definitely the visual feels a bit confusing. It feels like there's some inconsistencies in what the report says and what the visual shows. So I'm sure most people have seen this visual by now, but it's the inverted food pyramid as they call it. And so for example, like you have these huge images of meat, whole milk, and cheese on top in the bigger portion of what appears to be the foods that you would include more of, since it's now inverted and it's the bottom of the pyramids at the top. And then at the same time in the report, there's still these limits on saturated fat, but you have all these saturated fat rich foods. So that's a little bit conflicting. And then also, it's a little bit confusing because you have vegetables on top with the meat, but then fruit is a little bit lower. So that could send a message of like fruit's not as important as vegetables, and people might try to prioritize more vegetables. And then lastly, whole grains are on the bottom, which I thought was interesting because the report does support a lot of the benefits of whole grains in the diet, and it recommends 2 to 4 servings of whole grains daily. So it's confusing that it's at the tip of the pyramid where you would think these are the things that you include the least of. When they're recommending 2 to 4 servings, they talk about the benefits of whole grains on the microbiome and why it's a better choice than refined grains. So I think it would be great to have some market research of people seeing the visual for the first time and then asking what their takeaways are. I think that would be really interesting to see.
What I do sometimes is just imagine what it was like putting this together. Like this, every single decision on this food pyramid was incredibly intentional and thought over. But like they scrutinized, a team of people scrutinized over exactly where each food would go here. This was not just thrown together. The thing, if we're just being critical of the image, which I think is super relevant and is probably the most outward facing thing that will come of this. Like most people aren't going to listen to an hour and a half long podcast about the guidelines. They're going to see this image. So I think you are right to bring up, hey, this image is, I just can't help but chuckle that they had to put 2 different kinds of red meat on here. Like it wasn't enough to just put this massive ribeye. They also had to put like chopped meat, like a ground beef. It's crazy. They had to put 2 different kinds of red meat. Like somebody was like, oh, we're going to put the steak up here. And then somewhere along the lines of this committee this group of people sitting around a long table was like, someone raised their hand. They're like, I think we should put ground beef on this thing. And everyone's like, yeah, like how come we needed 2 different kinds of red meat? I just find that hilarious. You're so right to say I'd love to see some market research of what the take home is. And again, I think we both do a somewhat shoulder shrug of like, I don't think people are like putting this on their refrigerator and then building meals off of it. I don't think that's happening for the most part. It's happening more than 0 times for sure. And one of the fears that I do have is that people will just take the things that they like from the dietary guidelines and leave all the things they don't, and just add more red meat and butter because that's the confirmation they needed to lean more into that, and then not do the eat less, ultra processed foods with added sugars, etc. And for that person, that will be a net negative change. And so that is
Yeah.
something I fear. But you're right. Again, I don't want to get overly worked up. I don't think people are pinning this up on the refrigerator and building meals like this. But the idea of putting a second kind of red meat on here, like, was just, we get it. We get that you
Yeah.
think red meat's super important and that we should have more. But like, damn, dude, 2 spots on here, crazy.
Yeah. And I think now's also, before I go into my other two takeaways from the guidelines, like a good point to kind of give history of the visuals, because if you go to the website where the dietary guidelines are published, the government website, I think it's realfood.gov, but don't quote me on that. And they say, we've inverted the food pyramid for decades. The food pyramid has been making us sick. And if you actually look at the image of the food pyramid they give, it's the one from 1992. And so if you look at historically what the different visuals look like, there was that pyramid in 1992. And then in 2005, it was a new pyramid, which was called the healthy eating pyramid. And it also included the steps of someone walking on the side. And then in 2011, it was updated to the plate, my plate, or the healthy eating plate. And so since 2011, so 15 years now, we haven't had a pyramid. So again, a little bit confusing in terms of where this is coming from, that like this pyramid that's been discontinued for 15 years is keeping us sick, and that's what we're targeting.
Yeah, what do you think about the use of a pyramid in general versus my plate? Like, why, why, one of the critiques of my plate is that it says it's not food specific, it's categorical, and that because it says like whole grains, it's a protein, vegetables, fruit, it doesn't give specific food examples and is thus less applicable. That's a critique that I've heard. But
Yeah.
I guess I see that, I suppose, but I think the food pyramid is almost harder for me to apply, other than like, hey, eat the foods closer to the top more. But from a building meal perspective, I find the plate graphic to be more how people eat and how people construct meals. And I wonder why not find a place for that here. If you like, okay, fine, like whatever, do what you want to, change the recommendations, but why do away with the plate? Why go back to a pyramid? And then why flip the pyramid? I was curious about that too. Why is upside down pyramid feel more, why does that feel more applicable? Does it feel more applicable? I'm not sure.
I don't personally, like you said, I think the plate is more translatable to how people are eating. If you have a visual of the plate, you also have a visual of your own plate that you're eating at. I think the only way that the pyramid becomes useful is if we start selling plates shaped like a pyramid, and then you can fill in the foods there. I think that would be the best way. But if you look at also, and I know we're going to go into like other countries' guidelines, most of them use some form of a plate. There are a lot of other visuals, don't get me wrong, but pretty consistently the ones in the last few years are a plate. I forget which country has a wheel. The wheel is interesting, but I like the plate the best.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, so do I. And again, I'm trying not to get overly worked up about it. I don't think people are pinning it to their fridge, and but I do question that again, that's a decision that was made at this metaphorical roundtable of like, we're doing away with the plate, we're going back to the pyramid. Like, what was the rationale? What sort of argument won everyone over? Of like this, maybe it was, maybe tinfoil hat on, maybe it was just an attempt to leave nothing of previous administration's work and just do away. If you leave the plate, you acknowledge something good about somebody else having done something, and maybe there's just some bitterness, and I don't know, whatever. It's something of like, I don't want to keep any of the things we used to have.
Yeah. And I think that's where it can become an issue from a political standpoint. Like this shouldn't be political in the sense that it should be based off of evidence, and it should be with the ultimate goal of making people healthy. But yeah, I think kind of going into my second point, which is the discordance between the saturated fat limit, the quantitative limit at 10%, which we've had that for previous guidelines as well. The American Heart Association actually recommends 6%. Um, and so that, and then the messaging, like not just the visual showing all these saturated fat rich foods, intentionally putting whole milk, which is more saturated fat than fat free or low fat milk, but also the messaging. And I think this is actually what probably is influencing people the most, like the headlines, the press conferences, even more than the visual. Like there's probably a lot of people who aren't going to sit down and analyze the visual, let alone the report, but they're going to say, okay, I watched this press conference and they were talking about how we need to focus on whole foods that are great sources of healthy saturated fats. We've demonized saturated fats for so long. And just to clarify for the listener, that's not my stance. I mean, I think we're pretty clear on the evidence that limiting saturated fat is a good idea, keeping it at 10% of calories or less. But I think that that causes more confusion. And so you might have people walking away from these press conferences or headlines that say red meat is back, um, thinking that those are the foods that they should focus on. And I think that that might do more harm than the visual itself. But ultimately, you go back to the report and it says keep your saturated fat under 10% of calories, which, if you ask me, is virtually impossible given their recommendations.
Yeah, if you had to speculate as to why or how this discordance has occurred, what would you say?
I think a lot of it was ideological in the sense that we saw the narrative for a long time was focused on demonizing all processed foods, and we can go into some of the nuances of processed foods as well. That was one of the points that I brought up in terms of discordance between the committee's report and the actual final guidelines, which I can go into some of those points too. But I think this focus on whole foods over processed foods, while very broadly speaking, is not a bad recommendation. It's come at the cost of potentially harmful recommendations in the sense that just because there's a whole food like, let's say, red meat, that doesn't mean that it's without harm and we should try to eat more of that. Like we still see limits on a whole food like red meat and, full fat dairy and things like that for a reason. And so I think it kind of goes hand in hand with this ideologic perspective of natural is better, where it goes hand in hand with kind of like the we're being poisoned intentionally by our food system and by the people who are trying to make recommendations to us. So by kind of tossing that away and saying no processed foods, focus on real foods, they want to also amplify the consumption of some of these whole foods that do come with harm.
It's clear. It's just if you're paying attention, it's clear. Like they this administration led by RFK believe that red meat is just something you should be consuming as a staple of your diet, that butter is a healthy fat, that the term healthy saturated fat is not an oxymoron. And again, I wouldn't say it's an oxymoron technically if we're being honest. I think too much saturated fat is not healthy. Not that any amount is not healthy, but that term has, it's almost like they have linked those words together now, healthy saturated fat, trying to have that roll off the tongue. And that's clear with just whatever, putting the meat and butter on the top of the pyramid.
Yeah.
To me, again, conspiracy circle table, people putting this together, they would have liked to do away with that 10% mark as well, is what I suspect, is that they would have
Yeah.
liked to do away with that. But in my mind, that would feel like just so abruptly against worldwide consensus that it would have been indefensible as of now. So what they said
Yeah.
was, we'll leave that and we'll do what will fly a little less, a little more under the radar, which is just change some of the food recommendations. Even
Yeah.
if there's like for anybody paying attention, like a blatant discordance between those two things, like you said. And the second thing is, I think if they were if they were like, hey, we're going to pick between these two things, we're going to adjust that 10% and we're going to get rid of it, or we're going to up that level, or we'll change the food things. They know that, like dear listener listening right now, like you probably have no idea what 10% of your total calories in terms of saturated fat and like what that equates to in terms of it's so abstract. They're like, screw
Yeah.
it, we'll leave that in there because that's not affecting anybody's choices. Almost never. I mean, like, have you tracked your saturated fat intake, Akash? Have you looked at it before?
No,
Yeah.
no. And I'm pretty focused on my diet. I've tracked my diet pretty religiously for long periods of time. But again, I just focus on limiting the foods. But I think that also goes back, there's historical context that I can't remember the year, but when they started putting in recommendations to limit saturated fat, it was actually a recommendation to limit meat and dairy. And the meat and dairy industries, that's where industry influence comes in, intentionally said, no, let's just call it saturated fat. So that kind of adds a layer of confusion that the general public then has to unravel to get to the answer of like, okay, what are the sources of saturated fat in my diet? And I think that's where industry influence comes into play. And we've seen a lot of the influence of the meat and dairy lobbies, even outside of dietary recommendations, but with marketing campaigns. Like Got Milk was a huge campaign. So I think there's definitely industry influence in that sense.
Yeah, agreed. Let's go with your third point.
Yeah. So my third point, I would say, was probably just a grouping of some of the like little mistakes, but that really aren't that little because it kind of reduces the credibility of the overall report. When we talk about how thoughtful and careful the advisory committee's report is, and then you see certain mistakes, like I'll give a few examples. There's a line about including olive oil because it's a source of essential fatty acids. And in reality, olive oil, it's healthy, great for you, but it's not a source of a good source of essential fatty acids like ALA, which is an omega-3, or linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid. And ironically, there's this war on seed oils, which are keeping us sick. But if you actually want to say what's a good source of linoleic acid, it's vegetable oils. So I think mistakes like that, there was also like an incorrect citation where if you go to the citation supporting one of their claims, it takes you to a paper on something completely different. So I think that sort of sloppiness is I think that's ultimately what you can call it, is reducing the credibility of the overall guidance.
Are you surprised they didn't go harder on seed oils?
No. I actually did expect them to. No, you're right. I did go into it thinking that there was going to be full-blown demonization of seed oils, but there wasn't. Yeah, how about you?
Yeah, there's one line when in the again, if you go to the website and you scroll through all of it, there is one line about from it says to eating real food to avoid industrial oils is the terminology they use. But no, I kind of was, but I just again I feel like that would be a complete divergence from the advisory committee to a level that I just don't know they're ready to do yet. I think there are a couple of these things that feel like stepping stones to me if they can continue to drive the narrative, that they can continue to push some of these things further. And I think if we have in 5 years similar people at the helm, that we would see that come in. But who knows? Was there anything that you liked, right? That you were like, hey, this is not like, there's a whole host of things we like about the guidelines, by the way, for the listener. There's a whole host, we'll talk about this a bit more, but the guidelines are better by far than the average American diet.
Yeah.
And, if you follow them and you were eating chips and soda and pizza and cake and you went to following the guidelines, like we talked about the healthy eating index, like you'd
Yeah.
see improved health, right? It'd be better.
Yeah.
And again, there's do you want to rattle off some of the stuff that you at least feel are good recommendations, either ones that were there already, and then we can kind of differentiate between ones that were added that you feel are good updates?
Yeah, kind of the way I view it broadly is most of the quote good recommendations were ones that were already in place. I think the two differences that we can get into are the discussion about processed foods and why that wasn't included in the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee's report. There were specific reasons for that, which we can go into. And then the increased protein intake, which again, do we think that a recommendation that high is necessary for the average person who's not resistance training? I'm all for the increased focus on protein. I think a little bit higher than the zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram that's currently recommended is definitely a good idea. But do they also really need to go up that high if they're not training? So I think those were the two good recommendations that I guess were a little bit more defensible. Um, but I think also, right, like I saw a lot of people online, and maybe I'm just being overly critical, but I was a bit surprised to see a lot of people in the evidence-based space taking the position that like overall these guidelines aren't that bad. And that I think that's a reasonable stance when you compare it to the standard American diet, but I think that shouldn't be the standard. Like when you see how thorough, careful, and time consuming the advisory committee's work is and the report and that process, I kind of feel like the guidelines are relatively abysmal because they had enough data. Like we have enough data and consensus to take a firm stance on things and had a huge opportunity to improve on the last report with those tweaks. But I feel like we've taken steps backwards. And is it really commendable to say, oh, yeah, they put vegetables on top? Like, to me, that's a bare minimum. But when we're holding the US government to a certain standard and they have the time and money to put together a report from the top experts, this should be a lot more thorough and we should be taking firmer stances on some of these things. So I think, yeah, like overall it's better than what the average American eats, but that's a low bar. Like we had the opportunity to take this to a very thorough level when you have this committee of experts putting together a detailed and thorough report for you.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I was also, I felt it was pretty bad, but not because I think if you eat that way, you'll die tomorrow and that it's terrible and compared to the standard American diet that it's bad. That's not it. It's like you said, it's just the standard of like, I can't believe, you know what? I'll say it this way. I can't believe, I think I know a thing or two about nutrition, but I'm not a dietitian. I'm not, I'm not a scientist. And the fact that I can read these guidelines and find loads of issues with them.
Yeah.
That after you had 2 years of 20 of the top scientists in the country put together the most thorough, and like it just shouldn't be like that, And so the word you used was standard, and it's like I'm not bothered by them because I think that they're 180 from the way you should eat. I'm bothered because I just expect it to be, I just expect it to be a well thought out, balanced consensus. You know, just expected better from the amount of work that goes into the committee's report.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And I think overall, these are relatively minor tweaks that are happening every 5 years in the grand scheme. They're not flipping like the diet upside down normally. In
Yeah.
this case,
Right.
literally.
Yeah.
But like it's mostly the unsexy stuff that you said. The eating lots of fruits and veggies, whole grains over refined grains, limiting saturated fat, limiting sodium, limiting alcohol, all these different things, eating more legumes. And from there, that's like the core that hasn't really changed. And so we were trying to improve on that and see how we can put in all this effort to get a little bit better. And that's where I feel like we've taken a step back because now we're glorifying foods that are high in saturated fat. So yeah, overall, not bad per se, but that's a pretty low bar.
Yeah. Yeah. I will touch myself on the protein recommendation quickly, and then I
Mhm.
want to give it over to you to talk about maybe differences between the committee's report and what ended up in the guidelines.
Yeah.
The protein recommendations, so they were updated to 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, roughly 0.55 to like 0.7 grams of protein per pound of body weight, whatever.
In freedom units.
In freedom units, yeah. And people love this recommendation. They love it.
Yeah.
They think it's amazing. And I will admit, I too thought, okay, cool, yeah, nice, like nice. And then I metaphorically would flip the page. The more I've thought, and the more I've consumed, and the more I've heard, and the more I've just reflected, I just don't like. People who listen to this podcast are self-selecting into a group that care about a little bit more than health. They're interested in body composition. They're interested in building muscle and building strength beyond just what's required for health. And I just feel like we don't have a protein problem, and to make that one of the, I mean, they are very proud of that recommendation. That's like a big thing. That's like, to make that the thing that you're like wearing on your cape. I just don't know. People out there are like, oh, I can't believe you're not stoked about that recommendation. It's just that I don't think we have a protein deficiency problem. I don't think that just getting people into the 1.4 gram per kilogram is going to make people much healthier. I think from 1.2 to 1.6, is actually where you see like near optimal muscle growth. We're not talking about like health outcomes on a population level. So in the fitness bubble, which is like most of my algorithm, let's say, there's a lot of, this is great, this is awesome, because like fitness people are in a group of people who care more about, diminishing returns level of muscle growth than population level health,
Yeah, and 2 points just to piggyback on that is protein in itself doesn't really tell you much about health outcomes. I think that goes for every macronutrient. It's what your source is of that macronutrient. And so if someone's going to go, let's say hypothetically, from zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight up to 1.6, like they double their protein intake, but all of that additional protein comes from saturated fat rich sources like red meat, whole fat dairy products, things like that. Is that trade-off worth it? Like, are you getting that much more benefit from the increased protein versus weighing out the detriment to your potential detriment to your health outcomes? And that's one point. I think the second point also is like, I think as a society, we leave so much on the table with resistance training. Like sometimes I feel like we focus more on protein than working out hard and consistently. And I think that's a whole separate conversation we could have. But like people are so obsessed with increasing their protein when they're leaving benefits on the table with actually increasing their resistance training intensity and volume.
Yeah. I'll say it for you is that protein doesn't do that much for muscle growth when you factor in the training stimulus as well. And the difference of 1.1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of protein is, less than consistently getting an extra workout in per week. And so, or going a little bit closer to failure, or training a little bit, throwing a few more minutes per week at your training. And so, yeah, definitely think we need to remember what really drives the needle there.
Yeah, I agree.
Sweet. Wow, we're at an hour. We have like 2 or 3 more topics. So let's see. I don't want to cut us short. I want us to be thorough, but let's move to some of the main differences that you saw between the advisory committee's report and the guidelines themselves.
Yeah. So I think so actually they had a separate report called the Scientific Foundation for the Dietary Guidelines. This is what HHS and USDA published as the science supporting their guidelines. And so if you look at the first page of that report, the first few pages, they come up with 56 recommendations from the advisory committee that they received. And they have a literal table where they show did they accept or integrate those recommendations into the final guidelines or not? And so there's a yes, no, and partial. And they kind of check off, okay, no, we didn't listen to this. Yes, we listened to this.
No
and
way.
So all the way down. Yeah, so you can see exactly what they rejected. So for example, and kind of the 3 discrepancies or points that I want to go into are specifically with plant proteins, processed foods, and health equity and social determinants of health. I think those are the major points of discordance. So for example, starting with plant proteins, you already read that quote saying that we should move beans, peas, and lentils to the protein group. And not just that, but we should prioritize those protein sources and try to get most of our protein from these plant sources in the order that we list them. That's similar to AHA guidelines. Like since 2021, AHA guidelines made that update saying get most of your protein from plants. But you can see in that first few pages of the scientific foundation for the guidelines that they reject that recommendation. And you already read the quote, so I won't read it back here again. But I think and we'll go a little bit more, I know, into plant versus animal protein, but I think that was definitely an important change that we've seen across guidelines, like across the world, at least ones that have been updated in the last few years, where there's this emphasis on prioritizing plant proteins over animal proteins due to a lot of reasons, like from a public health standpoint, and we can go into some of that data later on, but also from a planetary health standpoint. So that's something that a lot of guidelines are incorporating now is how can we make public health recommendations that also improve environmental sustainability, address climate change, and things like that. So plant proteins was one of the ones where they rejected it.
Could I read?
Yeah.
One of what? So one of the recommendations was modify the dietary pattern to emphasize dietary intake of beans, peas, and lentils while reducing intakes of red and processed meat. That is a Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee recommendation, and this is fascinating. I don't know how I've not seen this. It's basically says yes, partial, or no. That was checked no. Like you said, reorganize the order of protein food subgroups to list beans, peas, lentils first. That's fascinating that the word first is there, because what the quote that I wrote was just adding them to the list, but this says reorder the subgroup list to put them first, followed by nuts, seeds, soy products, then seafood, and finally meat, poultry, and eggs. That was not followed. There was one more I wanted to read. Enhance the guidance. This is not related to plant protein, but enhance the guidance to indicate that replacement with basically unsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats should replace saturated fat. Sorry, replace saturated fat with unsaturated fat, particularly polyunsaturated fats, was not followed. That's fascinating to me that it's so... Like, I know that they didn't follow that because I read it in the guidelines, but it is just right here to say, hey, you told us that 2 years of working through the data says that we should put this in there. We said, nah, dude, I'm good. Like, it literally says, it's like, yes, partial, or like, nah, we're good. It's like,
Yeah.
that's crazy.
Yeah. It's almost worse that there's an acknowledgement
That's what I'm
because there's not
saying.
much
It's right here.
explanation. Yeah, there's
Right.
not much explanation of each of all 56 saying this is why we rejected this. It just says check off, nope, we didn't listen to this.
That's so crazy to me. That's so crazy.
Yeah.
All right, go to go
It,
to go to. We should talk about
yeah.
plant protein. Let's talk processed foods.
Processed
Yeah.
foods. Yeah. So the advisory committee actually came to the conclusion that at this point in time, we don't have enough data to give specific guidance on processed foods, which a lot of people gut instinct reaction is like, that's crazy. We know processed foods are bad for you. But I think there's also nuance around the processed foods discussion that I've grown to appreciate and that I wanted to share because I think that it definitely brings different perspectives. But broadly speaking, we know that it's probably better to eat whole foods than processed foods. But that level of processing, it's based off the NOVA classification. That's the one that's most commonly used. And it doesn't necessarily always correlate with the healthfulness of a food. And so when we look at data on processed foods at large, at it as a umbrella category, yes, we tend to see more negative health outcomes associated with it. But when we look at subgroups of different processed foods, like categories within this umbrella term, we actually see some are driving the risk, whereas others are actually protective. So, for example, like junk food that we think of, like chips, whatever you're thinking of, chocolate, sweets, whatever, is what's driving a lot of this risk, cake, whatever it might be. However, certain categories, the one that comes to mind is like whole grain bread and cereals are actually protective against a lot of these diseases. And so it makes you question what's actually driving the risk with processed foods. And a lot of times, what we see is it comes back to the simple fundamentals that we know. What does the nutrient profile look like? So the ones that are driving increased risk are the ones that are high in saturated fat, added sugar, a ton of calories, added sodium, and not providing a lot of nutrition or fiber. Whereas the ones like whole grain breads and cereals are low in saturated fat, are low in added sugar, the ones that are tend to be protective, not a ton of salt, as well as providing fiber and this source of whole grains. And I think that's an important distinction as opposed to just saying processing automatically makes a food unhealthy. Because now bringing this back to the dietary guidelines, there are also positives of processed foods that we don't think about from a food system level. And so one is that it increases accessibility for a lot of people. So it's extending shelf life of food. So if you can have healthy foods with good nutritional profiles with things that can extend shelf life, and are not necessarily driving the risk, then that's great because we also have a huge issue with food and nutrition insecurity and people actually being able to access healthy food. So I think that's one thing. And also processing has allowed us to fortify foods with additional nutrients, which is huge. So like something like the iodization of salt or folic acid fortification to prevent neural tube defects in babies during pregnancy. Like these are huge public health wins that were possible because of processing. So I think there's other angles to this. And kind of to tie it all together, what does this look like for the listener? What does this look like for the average person? So, like, if you go to the store, you could either buy, and I said whole grain breads and cereals generally protective, even though they're processed. So you could buy a $3 loaf, let's say, in the US, of bread that is whole grain but has preservatives. Or you can go to Whole Foods, assuming you have a Whole Foods in your area, and buy the $7 loaf. That's the same thing, just without the preservative. So now you have to worry about storing it in your fridge, whatever. And so if we see that both versions of that are protective for health, you can kind of see the harm in the messaging where you tell people, hey, you're killing yourself if you buy that $3 loaf. And you need to spend more than double, especially when there's already so many financial barriers to accessing healthy food. So you're asking them to spend more than double to avoid processing for no reason. And I think this is a way of thinking that I've fallen into in the past where I'll buy the $7 loaf because I think it's the preservatives that are killing me. When in reality, as a population, we're not eating enough whole grains, right? So hopefully that kind of clarifies some of the nuances, that explanation around processed foods. But that was why the committee didn't make hard recommendations yet, because we're still learning about what's driving the risk of processed foods. I'm not mad about the blanket recommendation to avoid all processed foods, but I think it's worth acknowledging that that comes with downside. And there's not the reason why that wasn't stated in the committee's report isn't because they're trying to keep you sick. It's because there's these other factors that you have to consider.
Yeah, this discussion of process classification and then it's a lot of semantics, and I don't mean that as like a throwaway. I mean it's a very interesting semantics. It's like how we classify things and then how we communicate it and then how people hear it. There's a big long line of telephone where it's like, hey, these foods are, it's the Nova classification. It's like five levels of processing, right, from 1 through
I think
5.
it's four.
Four, and the basically the higher the number, the more processed
Mhm.
it is. And to say like avoid processed foods, yeah, that's what that actually means is different from what maybe people hear. But I think that you are right to point out that that's complicated, and for the listener, the guidelines are harder on processed foods than the committee was, and the committee didn't make strong claims about avoiding processed foods, but the dietary guidelines did, and they explicitly state on multiple occasions avoid processed foods. Eat real food is the entire slogan, right? And what's the
Yeah.
opposite of a real food? It's a processed food. And what you're saying is correct in that that's complicated, and that there are many processed forms of processing, levels of processing, and processed foods, products that are net positive,
Yeah.
clearly. And I also have wrestled with this. Could the committee have been added those caveats and been as thorough as they were in other places? And could that have carried over? Could we have kept some of the language of, hyper palatable, ultra processed foods, high in sugar, salt, and added and fat and saturated fat? Could we have carried over some of those specifics to differentiate from something like a whole grain bread or a protein powder or a bean
Yeah.
pasta or Greek yogurt is probably, like there's so many,
Yeah.
or plant-based meat. I mean, it was, God forbid, you know, I wonder if we could have done that. And I also wonder, I wonder in a dark corner in a quiet space if that would have helped. Like, are people interested in that level of semantics, or will people actually, by hearing reduce processed foods, will they actually create a net positive where maybe they don't have the whole grain bread, right? Maybe they don't have the fortified cereal, but maybe they also reduce soda and junk food intake. And is that a net positive piece of advice on a population level? I don't know. I don't think, dude, I don't think for a
Yeah.
single second that the dietary guidelines saying that is going to make anyone eat less processed foods. Processed foods or sorry, again, I'm doing it now. Like in order to explicitly state what we mean, you have to say something like hyper palatable, ultra processed foods, high
Yeah.
sugar, salt, and fat, low fiber, low mic. You have to add all those caveats that it like you said, it becomes something that's complicated, and it just looks like the committee was like, we don't want it. We don't want to deal with all those caveats. We're just going to go with this eat real food thing. And is that a net positive? I think a lot of people think that it is. They're like, hey, like this is where the guidelines said or did something for the good of the people, not waiting for the science,
Yeah.
But I do think it's complicated. That's all.
I think that's a valid criticism to keep ourselves in check too, right? Like my job isn't to say that the advisory committee was 100% right and the guidelines are 100% trash, right? I think that that definitely could have been included. However, I do know that they also had predetermined questions that they were addressing going into it. So maybe they felt that that wasn't a big one to go in depth on and do a review of the science because there just wasn't enough. But at the same time, now we've gotten to a point where we have growing distrust of institutions of science and some of these players coming in that are saying, oh yeah, eat less processed foods really feels like a win to the public. And again, further drives that distrust in science
Yep.
and
Yep.
institutional guidance.
Yep. Yep. It looks more like they want to keep you sick and less like, hey man, this is just how science works, and sometimes it's slower, but most of the time it's for the best.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Anything?
My
Anything?
third,
Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, sorry, Jenner, go ahead. I was going to shift to my third point of discrepancy. I was going to say the health equity standpoint. So in the foundational report for the dietary guidelines on the first page, I can't remember the exact quote, but they specifically said like we rejected a lot of the recommendations, and I'm paraphrasing, but because they were written from a health equity lens. And that's an interesting stance because I think health equity and socioeconomic factors and social determinants of health are an absolute must to include in food guidance. And so I think the perfect example of why that's important is dairy. So one of the advisory committee's categories that they created was titled Dairy and Fortified Soy Alternatives. And the reason why they expanded to include fortified soy alternatives was out of recognition for the fact that a lot of people can't or do not want to eat dairy. So for, ethical reasons, a lot of vegans don't consume dairy, but also lactose intolerance rates are huge and specifically skewed towards non-white populations. And so if you want uh these guidelines to be inclusive of everybody that's in America, you have to acknowledge that there's very high lactose intolerance rates. And so that's why they included this category to be called dairy and fortified soy alternatives. In fact, there's actually a line in the report where they say that the 2020, I'll read this quote right here. They mentioned that we should consider not calling lactose-free options as alternatives because they should be essentially treated as an equal part of the dairy group to make people feel like they have an option that's nutritionally valuable equivalent. And so in the scientific foundation for the dietary guidelines, and I know we're jumping back and forth, which could be confusing for the listener, so I'll be clear. This is the one that was published with the actual guidelines. They say the 2025 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee framed its analysis through a health equity lens. In contrast, the Trump administration believes that the central framework for the dietary guidelines should be the best available nutrition science centered around what humans should eat to prevent and reverse chronic disease and support optimal health. And so we can see this discrepancy in the inclusivity and the awareness of some of the disparities between different ethnic groups, for example, with lactose intolerance being one example. But you see this now in the actual recommendations. There's not much discussion of dairy alternatives. And the dairy section says specifically aim for 3 servings of dairy. And when consuming dairy, include full fat dairy with no added sugars. Dairy is an excellent source of protein, healthy fats, vitamins, and minerals. So again, this put your tinfoil hat on if you want. Like this feels like dairy industry influence because there's no reason to not recommend those alternatives for a lot of people within the population that can't consume them.
Oh man, I'm actually. First of all, you explained that incredibly well, and it's a wonderful example. I'm a little bit fired up. I'm trying not to get too fired up. Um, I'm a little bit fired up about this. It again. Tinfoil hats on now. It's firmly on, which is this. It seems like, and I'm going to read you a quote. It seems like. Remember, we were just talking about, hey, this recommendation was not taken. This one not taken. This there were some, many that were not taken. It seems like they are. And I'll read you a quote. I'm not making this up. It seems like they are not taking those. It seems like we said that there's no reasoning that they didn't like. It's not like, oh, we didn't take that, and then there's a dash, and then it tells you why. I'll read you a
Yeah.
quote. It sounds like they didn't take them because they think those were equity related recommendations. So it says equity considerations or health equity related decisions. Health equity considerations and public policy preferences pervaded the DGAC report. The committee consistently advocated plant-based dietary patterns, deprioritized animal source proteins, and favored high linoleic acid and vegetable oils. For example, DGAC proposed reorganizing protein food subgroups to prioritize beans, peas, and lentils while listing meat, poultry, and eggs last, a symbolic reordering lacking scientific justification. The report recommended that fat replacements focused on plant-based sources encouraged dietary patterns that increased plant and decreased animal-based food proteins, and continued long-standing recommendations for low-fat dairy and butter replacement, despite emerging evidence that calls these positions into question. Essentially, like we didn't take those into account because those were health equity related recommendations, and we tried to stick to the best current available science. That's a load of poppycock.
Yeah. Which is like this committee is there to review the best available evidence, and the best available evidence consistently shows that doing these substitutions of animal protein and shifting more towards plant protein in your diet is a beneficial swap. And we can kind of go into that later on. I have some data on that, but it's just it is frustrating. It feels like a spin on the data and intentional confusion of the public because they didn't like what it said about animal proteins. And I know that sounds like I'm getting into a he says, she says, but it just seems pretty apparent from everything we've gone through.
Yeah, man. It's They also there's the next paragraph is them basically being like, and they didn't even say anything about processed foods. Like that's basically the next paragraph where like, damn, like instead of discussing processed foods, the report emphasized air quote cultural adaptation and air quote flexibility over clear measurable guidance. Dude, I'm fired up right now.
In
I'm
my
fired
opinion,
up.
those are good things. Like we
Totally, those are
should be
great things.
like I think that's what's great about when we talk about the unsexy groups of like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, like those are just categories. And then you can, based on your cultural background or taste preferences, pick legumes within that category or pick fruits and vegetables that are locally available to you or culturally familiar. And that's, I think, the beauty of like these broad guidelines is they're doing a balancing act between clear recommendations and still making it flexible and adaptable for with so many things in consideration.
I can keep going, but I will hold myself back. I just crack up at this list of like nope, like a piece of advice that I read and I'm like, oh, that seems reasonable. Again, this like round table, they're like there's one that's like include more nutrient dense plant based meal and dietary recommendation options, and they're like nope. They're like
With no
nah.
explanations.
No, they're like
Yeah.
nope.
Yeah.
It's
Yep.
hilarious. Oh man. Is there anything else
Uh,
on our guidelines that you feel compelled to say today?
no, I don't think my blood pressure could handle more.
Um all right, let's move on to just a look at other countries' guidelines and I'm not going to hold you to having memorized. I mean, you guys did a post that we could pull up about some of the other countries, but after this whole discussion about our guidelines and the committee report, it, there's something to be said about like, all right, but like, what are other countries doing? So you did a bit of research looking into this. What have you found?
Yeah, and my disclaimer is I did receive a little bit of criticism on the post. My criticism being that they were mostly Western nations that I included. And the only reason for that was because when I was going through and filtering, I was looking specifically for countries that have updated their guidelines in the last few years. So I wanted recent ones, as well as ones where I could find it in English so I can actually validate it myself. And so if maybe a criticism of me not being multilingual enough, but I just want to put that disclaimer out there
Fair.
that these are largely Western and like European nations. And that wasn't to, you know, discredit or not acknowledge other nations.
Sure.
But yeah, so we see this this quote that I put in that I had in one of my videos was these guidelines don't just contradict scientific evidence, but also isolate us from global consensus. And what I meant by that is there's this common theme in recent years where there's an overall shift towards more plant-based diets. And at its core, it's always been, like I said, we've repeated this unsexy list of whole grains, fruits, veggies, nuts, seeds, but it stopped at the protein source. And what we're seeing now is the recommendation to get protein mostly from plants. And that's been a common theme across a lot of different guidelines. Definitely a big cultural shift for the United States to get on board with that. But this is a pretty consistent shift across different countries' guidelines. And that's because they're not just incorporating public health recommendations, which in itself would still recommend that, but there's an even stronger case now when taking into consideration planetary health. So that's something that a lot of these guidelines are recommending is they're looking at the environmental impacts of food as well because we're facing a climate crisis and all these different things. Um, and so there was actually the Eat Lancet Commission, which was put together to come up with the planetary health diet. And so that was basically a diet that would address both public health and planetary health. They just last year came out with their second edition, their updated report. And I have to say, like, it was tedious because of I wasn't involved in the process, but I can only imagine how tedious it was because of how many factors were taken into consideration. So it's not just addressing public health, but also climate change. There was an economic analysis of like how shifts in our food system away from animal agriculture and more towards plant-based food systems would fare and the economic speculations of how that would fare, as well as also pandemic risk, worker rights because of a lot of the violations of labor rights in farming industries. So there's a lot to consider. But from a strictly public health standpoint, we're seeing this consistent shift. And also, there's been data on the first edition. So, the same way there's a healthy eating index to see how closely you adhere to the dietary guidelines, there's a planetary health diet index, seeing how closely you adhere to the planetary health diet. And we see that if you adhere more closely to this diet that's good for the planet, you also have reduced risk of chronic diseases and mortality.
Yeah, something that is becoming more clear is that our guidelines opted out of considering this is what whether they did a good job at this or not. I will say there was just a decision made at some point where, hey, we're only going to consider individual person's health. We are not factoring in planetary health, and we're not factoring in social determinants of health. And
Yeah.
there's a discussion. Maybe there's not a discussion. My heart says that this is a public health population size recommendation, and so those things really matter, and they should play some role. Ironically, I don't actually think some of the things that they avoided, like the plant protein stuff, diverges. I think you get a win in all of those, right?
Yeah.
Cheaper, better for the planet, better for you when you swap it out. So I think we're 3 for 3 there. But that's something that was very obvious. So I read your post with Matt and a couple other people, and I was like, yeah, there's a clear acknowledgement of planetary health in many of these other guidelines, and just, yeah, you use the word isolates us from global consensus. It just felt like I don't know, just felt isolating reading the consideration on that and then knowing we didn't do that.
And that's why I think that that position of like these guidelines aren't that bad is a really low bar. Like again, when you look at where the rest of the world is moving, it really is a low bar.
Could I read some of the could I pull up your post and just read
Yeah,
some of them? I think,
absolutely.
to say, like, for us to just say, hey, like their recommendations in Germany or whatever they're perfect and they're everything ours should be. That's not what we're saying, but I think it's important for people to hear, and I don't think that they have heard.
Yeah.
Looking at these are quotes in your post, right? So Norway, it says, if you follow the dietary guidelines, your diet will be
Yep.
healthy and
These are
varied.
direct quotes.
Yep. Choose mostly plant-based foods such as vegetables, fruits, berries, whole grains, beans, lentils, peas, and nuts. Use vegetable oils for cooking. Eat with pleasure and make time to sit down and eat.
Which I love that part.
As well. I love that part as well. Canada was updated in 2019. One of the key distinctions from previous iterations was the removal of dairy as an essential food group, and they use a plate. They use they do what we were talking about. So you get, I'll have this graphic in the show notes, or we'll put it up on screen for those of you watching on YouTube. Is they use something like my plate. So they have a plate and they've sectioned off the plate into different food groups, and then they don't just write whole grains or vegetables or proteins. They put the actual foods on the plate. So they show, a bunch of different types of protein in the corner where you would be putting protein, a bunch of type of so it's not hard to conceive of a way to combine the plate where that's quite applicable with the food forward approach that we went at. I'm like, yeah, this looks great. Like, I can tell, okay, these are the whole grains. You want me to have a quarter of my plate? There's breads, there's pasta, there's beans, there's quinoa, there's rice. It feels like, I'm like, wow, this is like just a nice marriage between those two things.
Yeah. And you'll see in the next two with Denmark and Germany, the specific quotes do mention the environment.
Yeah. Okay. So for Denmark, said, for the first time ever, Denmark's official dietary guidelines do not only guide Danes on how to eat healthier, but also how to eat with a lower climate footprint. And that sounds like we have to really give up our individual health for the good of the planet. But like, you don't really. It's like you just said, the Eat Lancet diet, they did an analysis and said the closer you eat to this, like, good things happen. And so it's not like you have to diverge. It's not like you have to have, like, I think people think we're eating like post-apocalypse style of like, we just have to eat canned tuna and really take care. It's not like that, it's like a slight shift towards a plant forward diet. Germany,
I think,
go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to say, I think that individual health and planetary health for many reasons are linked. Like ultimately what happens to our planet is going to come back and influence our population as a whole.
Yep. I'm going to read Germany and then we'll move on to our last topic, which is eat healthy and colorful food, protect the environment at the same time, as recommended by the DGE. If you primarily eat fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, as well as nuts and vegetable oils, you protect not only your health, but also the resources of the earth. This also includes preventing food waste. They recommend eat and drink well, show a way to increase the intake of plant-based foods, lower the intake of animal-based foods to protect health and the environment. So, like, I'm in. I don't know. I don't want to get too much on this, but I'm a little embarrassed. Like I respect that take a lot, and I
Yeah.
feel like I'd like to be a part of a place that cares about the earth as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
All right.
agree.
All right, let's move to our next topic. I'm going to let you set the scene. This is something you had brought up when I'd asked you what you were feeling particularly passionate about right now, and I really love where you went with it. So take the mic.
Yeah. I think there's been a bit of a cultural shift in the evidence-based space online in terms of trying to take a stance, a firm stance on plant proteins over animal proteins. And I think it's interesting. And an example that I bring up, and I feel that this is a big blind spot for a lot of people in the evidence-based space, not yourself. I think, I obviously have my own bias because I'm vegan for ethical reasons, but so maybe it's a lot easier for me to accept this data. Like, I'm not saying I'm some unbiased, objective guy who's able to put his biases aside. My biases favored me accepting this data. Whereas for a lot of people who grew up eating meat, it's such a big part of their taste preferences, their culture, it might be a little bit harder. But here's just an example of why I think it's a big blind spot. So I was looking at data from the two of our biggest prospective cohorts that we often draw from, the nurses' health study and the health professionals follow-up study. So I found three different papers analyzing those two cohorts. The first one is looking at fruit and vegetable intake daily. So compared to eating, if you eat 5 servings per day, versus 2 servings, you'll have a 13% lower risk of total mortality. Okay, great. Everyone has no issues saying eat more fruits and vegetables. Now, another paper looking at physical activity data. So if you were in the highest category versus the lowest, you had for running a 13% lower risk of all-cause mortality. For jogging, it was 11%. For resistance training, 13%. Okay, great. Everyone thinks you should do more cardio and more resistance training. Now, in the same cohort, in 2020, Song et al. Looked at the association of animal and plant proteins with all-cause and cause-specific mortality. And they found that replacing just 3% of your calories from unprocessed red meat with the same amount of calories from plant proteins was associated with a 13% lower risk of all-cause
That's
mortality.
crazy.
We're talking about, we're on par with the same effect sizes and similar data. So it's like if you're going to willingly accept this data, this epidemiologic data on physical activity, on fruit and vegetable intake, and make those strong recommendations, we should also be consistent and take a firm stance on recommending plant proteins to people. And we can go into, and I think you might be able to provide more insight on this as someone who's made that shift in the last few years, but why that is. Like, I see a lot of people in the evidence-based space online where they're recommending fruits, veggies, whole grains, physical activity, all these things that there's consensus on, but then they stop short of like, just choose whatever protein source you want. And I think a big part of that blind spot is personal bias. And again, I don't say that from a point of judgment because I was raised vegetarian. I've never eaten meat. So it was really easy for me to be like, when I came across this data and accept that because it's very similar to how I ate. However, I think it's such an important swap beyond just public health that we should check in with our own biases and recognize that it is a big lever to pull on. And so, if I can just touch on real quick before you give your insights, some of the other benefits of making that transition. We talked about some of the public health and health benefits with some of that data, but also from an environmental standpoint. So, land use per 1,000 calories provided. Beef uses around 120 square meters of land to provide 1,000 calories. Tofu uses 1.3 square meters. So a huge difference. And then when we look at greenhouse gas emissions per 1,000 calories, I'm using beef and tofu again because these are common examples of animal and plant proteins. Beef emits around 36 kilograms of CO2 equivalents, whereas tofu, it's 1.2 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. So that's the environmental standpoint. And then the ethical standpoint. I know not everyone's vegan. I'm vegan for ethical reasons, but I think most reasonable people, when it comes down to it, are like, if I don't have to cause unnecessary death, and I don't think that should be a controversial take, but like if I don't have to cause unnecessary death and I can still find ways to get my nutrition and my protein, we can dramatically reduce and hopefully maybe one day eliminate the killing. And just to put into perspective, like we kill 80 billion land animals per year. There's 8 billion people on the earth. And if we take into account fish, you get into the trillions. So if you want something really depressing, there's like clocks that just keep going. And it's like from the moment you get on the website, how many of each animal have been killed. Really depressing. And I think a lot of these animals are similar to our pets, but we don't think about it because it's not happening in front of us. So that's one. And I won't, go on a lot about the ethical side, but also some other things that we don't think about are the zoonotic disease and pandemic risk associated with animal agriculture, and also antimicrobial resistance. So we've really slowed in our development of antibiotics in the last few decades. There was definitely a period after like penicillin where we're coming out with more and more antibiotics. And that's the reason why our top causes of death shifted from infectious causes to now cardiometabolic diseases, these non-communicable diseases. But where does animal agriculture come into this? So I think roughly 70% of antibiotics in the US are sold to the animal agriculture industries. And that's because if these animals are kept in pretty shitty conditions, you don't want them getting sick. So you give them antibiotics, and we are potentially being exposed to these antibiotics through our food supply, which is might be causing some of the resistance. So just realizing that like there's so many different things that are affected by pulling this one lever. And that's not to make it feel like an overwhelming decision or you have to go 100% vegan. But if you can find a place to find a plant protein that you want to swap, it also often tends to be cheaper. And you can speak to your experience making that transition cheaper and also easier to prepare. So that's my big spiel on the whole plant versus animal protein. I think all in all, if we can influence so many different factors on a daily basis, it's almost empowering, right? Like we could do so much good, not just for ourselves, but also the world. And is it really worth letting our biases hinder that recommendation in the evidence-based space? So that's kind of my monologue.
Great monologue, dude. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Speaking as that person who's, it feels like to me, and I'd love to hear from you. It feels like to me that it feels like a no-brainer, right? It feels like a no-brainer for health, for planetary health, for my own health, for my financial health. But
Yeah.
it feels like it's become a no-brainer. Like I've been presented with data that has made it a no-brainer in the last 5 years, probably. And I don't know that data has just come out in the last 5 years. I think some of it has. But would you say that some of those pieces of epidemiological data and a lot of the substitution analysis data,
Mhm.
is that recent, or has it? I don't have the dates of those papers. Have been presented to them ad nauseum by wonderful creators like yourself that has convinced me a ton. But is that new data, or are we just like, for some reason this has caught a bit of a momentum?
Yeah, I think it also has to do with like how science is interpreted. Like there's never really a switch that's flipped. Like you're looking at multiple lines of evidence converging towards like a clear picture. So if we look at the data on like saturated fats, which tend to be in animal proteins, and unsaturated fats in plant proteins, if we look at the data on fiber, which plant proteins tend to have more fiber, like all of these kind of just point to the same picture. So we might have just gotten more clarity on the picture with some of these substitution analyses in the last 5 or 6 years. But I think ultimately, like it's always pointed in that direction. It's just become more and more clear now where this is something we can't ignore. And it really is a no-brainer. And we have a lot of influence for, as people online and also working with patients to recommend that. I think there's also a stigma of like, if I say you should be eating plant protein over animal protein, like people might think I'm a vegan or something, right? Like I think there's that stigma amongst omnivores, which is understandable. But I think if we can break through that and find ways as just evidence-based people to make that recommendation and take a firmer stance, the exponential effects are huge. Like I just listed all of those different factors you're influencing. And if you're influencing all your patients and your followers, then there's the exponential effect of all of their dietary changes. So
Yeah, I think if you were like, hey, I mean, there's a lot of questions to ask. It's like we can use me as a hypothetical person who's presented with compelling data and then struggles with the a certain level of implementation of what he knows, like a cognitive dissonance to some degree. You know, even without the ethical side, I think first of all, I struggle with the ethical side. Whatever. This isn't like a
yeah.
you didn't make. I know you didn't give that monologue to make me sweat about the ethical side of things, but like the truth
No.
is, like I want to sweat. I mean, it's like watching a hard documentary on the Holocaust. Like it's hard to watch, but it's good. It's good to know. It's good to watch hard things and experience sad things. And so listening to you say that, like it does make me sweat. But I know we'll park that for 1 second. I think, of course, they're both. We could talk about just from an individual health perspective, the ethical, moral side of it. they are separate things. Is it okay to say that they're separate things? Because I think that we can talk about them separately, even though they're, of course, intimately tied together.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an intersectionality of this all, and that's kind of what I want people to see is that like public health, environmental health, how we treat animals, like this all ties together. However, I think you can say that these are distinct motives because I've met people who have cut out animal products for health reasons. I've met people who have cut out animal products for ethical reasons and they eat what's like a junk food vegan diet. And then I've also met people who have cut out animal products strictly for environmental reasons and they cut out,
Interesting.
they don't care about their health or the morals of it. So I think the fact that there are multiple reasons that people come to the same dietary changes shows that these can be distinct things.
No, and after hearing you say that, I think if I look at my motivation for making some of the changes I've made, it's not been one thing. It's been all of them. And so I think they are all important. And, you know, yeah, you're not putting me on the spot as to like, okay, well, like what's been your situation? But I do find it for someone who's been in the air quote nutrition space for 15 years or so, like something that's just been interesting where it's like something that didn't fit my bias early on, and at some point the level of information became overwhelming. It became overwhelmingly clear that it's not that having a little bit of red meat was killing me. It was like, hey, these substitution analyses where people eat a little less animal protein, a little bit more plant protein, plus it being better for the environment, plus the ethical side of things, adds up in aggregate to a bit of a no-brainer. And I guess speaking to the listener, a bit of what's helped me. And you do this all the time. You must encounter this all the time. Like, I'm not here to guilt people into change. I think
Yeah.
we are presenting information and letting people decide for themselves. But so one of the things that's really helped me, a couple of things have helped me. Helped me / convinced me the data is clear. Eating more plant protein or animal protein, better health outcomes basically across the board. There was another analysis. I think it was the nurses health study maybe, where it was like just like people aging free of certain ailments, and it was like the thing that was linked most to aging without, it was either physical or cognitive ailments, was how much plant protein, the percent of diet from plant protein, something like that.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things actually has been lowering my obsession with like shifting the dial between protein and fiber in terms of how my subconscious and my conscious thinks of them in terms of level of importance. Like, it is probably true for current omnivores that the idea of getting that same amount of protein from legumes and tofu feels like a burden. But I think that's partially not true, right? If it maybe takes some practice, and again, you have to change culturally your traditions, what you eat, your maybe some taste preferences, that will take some time to change. But one of the things is like, yeah, if you're eating if you think you need to eat a gram per pound of protein,
Yeah.
it can be harder. I think that there are people in the plant-based community who would push back and say it doesn't need to be harder. Like, we can make it not harder. I'm with that. I think it still is technically a bit harder. However, if you update your protein recommendations to be like, I'm 190 pounds, I used to eat 225 grams of protein.
Wow.
That is just not necessary for any goal that I have.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's actually helped me be like, hey, I can eat more beans, I can eat more legumes and peas and lentils and et cetera, is aiming for less protein because I really don't need as much. And people hear less protein, they panic because we are in the proteinified, protein-centric part of human development right now, where protein's being shoveled down your throat. But like, hey, dude, if you eat 0.7, 0.6, 0.5, 5.5 to 0.7, 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kg, it's way more manageable. And it becomes the burden of like, well, there's no plant-based chicken breast. First of all, there can be, right? And so if I just eat beans, it's going to take me a ton of beans. It's like, first of all, slow down. Second of all, I just feel like, for me, if I'm like, hey, I want to get between, for me personally, maybe 130-ish grams of protein. It's like, all of a sudden, it's incredibly manageable. It's incredibly manageable. And now, I'm not 100% plant-based. But I think shifting the importance in my own mind of how important fiber is and how much protein I really need for the goals that I have, being less than maybe 20-year-old me would think, has really made it a whole lot easier to include more, let's just say, legumes and soy products, let's say. And that's been it's not hard, and I don't think it's been hard to go to dramatically reduce my animal protein intake and dramatically increase my plant intake. I will say I am currently finding that last bit, and no one's asking me, no one's saying
Yeah.
to go that last bit makes you a better person or dramatically improves health outcomes to go from 95% to 100. No one's saying that. Less is better, for the planet, for your health, for your wallet, whatever. But that's where I'm at. So I'm sitting on that, like, let's call it a 90-10. Let's call it an 80-20, where it was 80-20, 90-10 in the other direction. And I'm just sitting on that for a second and seeing how I feel. I think the thing that would ultimately take me from 80-20 to 90-10 is the ethical side of things, because I don't know if you can point to a very specific, compelling data set that says, hey, going from 90% plants to 100% plants dramatically improves health outcomes. I don't think you could find that. So I don't think that will motivate me, right? I don't think that would be the thing that would motivate me. I think it would be the ethical side of things. But yeah, I do feel compelled to continue ringing that bell, and because I don't find it to be overly challenging to include more beans in your diet, and I feel great. Fiber is good. Protein hasn't stopped me from building muscle and being strong and fit and all of those things. Super satiated. It's not
Yeah.
has not been the
Poops are
challenge.
great. Poops are great.
Poops are
Yeah,
on point.
that's the
Farts keep
best
my
part.
wife like a fair distance away.
Yeah.
But
I
yeah,
and I totally agree with you, right? I think that's kind of tricky for me to communicate online because I've always held this stance from a health standpoint and an objective science point that you don't necessarily need to be 100% plant-based. However, it can be done healthily, or healthfully. So if you have other reasons, and so like I wasn't 100% plant-based my whole life, right? And even though I was raised vegetarian, I used to eat like cheese and eggs with every meal. And so, like you said, I got to that 90%, and it wasn't health that pushed me that last 10%. It was like, I'm already almost there. And then I kind of had to like swallow the ethical side of things and watch some documentaries and stuff. And then it felt like a more doable jump. But you're right. Like, I don't think health is what's going to take people from 90 to 100. And overall, as a population, my goal right now is I would rather get everybody to that 90% than like worry about getting everyone to that 100% right now.
what's your pitch to the person who's compelled by our conversation today for some low hanging fruit to make just shift that dial just a little bit?
Yeah, I think specifically with protein sources, just familiarizing yourself with the protein sources that exist. So like I know Jacob Foods was documenting like he was discovering plant protein sources and like
I love how you
it'll
say was, because he's
yeah.
been taken down by
Yeah.
the meat
Yeah.
Illuminati or something like.
He still is. He's
Yeah.
still on his soy boy path,
Yes.
but just lost his account for that's a
Yes.
whole separate issue.
Yes.
But yeah, and I think a lot of people walk past this section of foods at the grocery store, and I did too. Like I remember my first time eating tofu. Like I was in my 20s, dude. Like eating tofu or tempeh, and I was like, holy shit, this stuff
What
exists.
were you doing as a
Like,
vegetarian living at home, not eating tofu and tempeh?
dude, I was just eating
Just
cheese on
crushing
everything.
cheese and eggs.
Cheese and eggs.
Just
Cheese and
crushing
eggs.
cheese and
I'm
eggs.
telling you.
Yeah.
I had high cholesterol as a kid, which we're already at 2 hours, but that's a different story. So anyway, yeah, so I think just familiarizing yourself with like at the supermarket, you'll see like there's tofu and like 2.99 for a block, like a super firm block that's 70 grams of protein. And then just looking up a recipe. And I think the way to start is look up something that you already like, right? Like you want it to be familiar with the one swap. And there is now a plant-based version of every recipe out there, even cultural recipes, like no matter what cultural background you come for. I think I follow a creator from almost every cultural background that makes plant-based versions. And I think that's really important. Like we want the cultural reminiscence of food and familiarity. Like we pass down recipes through generations. Food's so sentimental to us, and it's not just a means of nutrition and like fueling us. I think it has a lot more value. So I would say familiarize yourself with like tofu, tempeh, seitan, like all these things in that section, and see if you can swap one meal. Like don't make it feel like this big boogeyman. For me, veganism was a boogeyman in my head. Like I was like, oh, that's a later problem to worry about because that's probably going to take a full overhaul of my life, my ethics, my dietary choices. And it can feel a lot less intimidating when you realize a healthy omnivorous diet is not that different from a healthy vegan diet or plant-based diet. Like it really just comes down to maybe just like taking out some of the low-fat yogurt, swapping that for a soy-based yogurt, or a little bit of fish, whatever health promoting things are in an omnivorous diet, just cutting those out and then kind of focusing on the plant proteins. I think it feels like a bigger jump than it is, and it's more of a psychological barrier. And I get a lot of it is just social conditioning and what we're used to. And so I think familiarize yourself with the plant proteins, look up one recipe, take it step by step, see what's easy and convenient for you. Um, and yeah, I think for any like, gym rats out there, I gotta shout out the fava bean tofu. I don't know if you've ever seen that one. The macros on that, it's all protein and no fat and no carbs.
Yeah, but don't.
So,
What's the PD cast on that, dude? I'm
oh,
just kidding. I'm kidding.
we're
I'm
gonna have
kidding.
to
I'm
record
kidding. I'm
another
kidding. I'm
two
kidding. I'm
hours.
kidding. I'm kidding. I like that the general recommendations just start slow. I think honestly for me, it didn't even start as a pursuit of making any sort of transition. It was just like beans are super healthy, and beans and legumes are super healthy, and they just weren't a big part of my diet. And so I actually didn't even begin with making any swaps. I was like, I just got to eat more beans and lentils. I got to eat more
Yeah.
beans, peas, and lentils. I got to get these in my life. And the more I became familiar with them, the more I enjoyed them, the more I made them in different ways, and found out that they could be a bit more of a foundation of my diet rather than an afterthought. And it felt as a nice tiptoe for me to say, I don't need to change anything. I'm just going to add some of these foods, work on making them in a way that I enjoy, that's convenient for me and my family, let my digestion catch up. No, just kidding.
I think that's a great general approach. Sorry to cut you off.
It's
I was
good.
just going to say, like, adding instead of removing is a lot more feasible, and focusing on what to eat more of. Because again, what makes like these more plant-forward dietary patterns healthier is not just the limitation on some of these animal foods, but also including a wide variety of health-promoting plant foods. And so I think taking that gradual approach, like, for me, I swapped out my scrambled eggs every morning for a tofu scramble, and that got better over time. And I was like, okay, let me also add beans, a can of beans to this, because that'll also make it, healthier, add more fiber, and I'll get some legumes in. And then I was like, let me also add a pack of seitan to this, which adds 70 grams of protein. And so now I've built something that's high fiber, high protein, and I love the taste of. So I think it takes a little bit of trial and error. It's a new learning curve, but after that initial learning curve, it really is a lot more feasible than a lot of people think.
Yep. Agreed. All right, man. We'll let you out of here on the 2 hour mark. You've done your service here. Why don't you tell people where they can find you, and if there are any parting words, if you don't need to give some big speech here, if there's something you think we missed that you wanted to say, you wanted to cover, now's the time. Otherwise, just you plug and get moving.
Yeah, I think so. In terms of finding me places, my cap on my I guess what I can tolerate mentally is just Instagram. So I'm on Instagram with Akash Patel, spelled out, my first name and last name. And yeah, I don't post super consistently on there. I try to, obviously busy with some other stuff, but my parting words are, ooh, putting me on the spot, man. I think I think a lot of information can feel overwhelming in today's space. Like, people hear conflicting information, and so really just being kind to ourselves when we're trying to make decisions 3 times a day when we sit down to eat. Like, yes, it's a form of empowerment. I said it's a strong lever that we can pull, but also take that bit by bit if you need to. And I think don't be hard on yourself because you're in a food system that makes it hard to be healthy, and then on top of that, in a social media environment and media online with news outlets that intentionally make it confusing and contradictory.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice for being on the spot. You hit a home run there. Good stuff, dude.
Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate
Thanks for
it.
coming on, man. Appreciate it.
Of course.